well, thank you all so much for joining us for the history of distilled spirits in and around Boston. It is July 5th, 7 o'clock here in Tewksbury, and author Zachary Lamothe is here to discuss his brand new book, Distilled in Boston, A History and Guide with Cocktail Recipes. Boston has a long history with distilled spirits from colonial times through Prohibition. More recently, there has been a resurgence in the craft distilling industry from Cape Ann to Cape Cod. Regional standouts such as Boston Harbor Distillery, Bully Boy Distillers, and the Short Path Distillery have opened up a brand new era with more than a dozen new businesses now on the scene. The ingredients, production processes, and marketing techniques are as varied as the beverages themselves. So we're joined by author Zack Lamothe as he reveals the backstory of the popular craft spirit movement in the greater Boston area. And a little bit about Zack: he's the author of several books, including Connecticut Lore, More Connecticut Lore, and The History Lover's Guide to the South Shore, as well as a book that he's previously spoke to us about called Classic Restaurants of Boston. Zack graduated from Boston University with a degree in American Studies, and he holds a master's from Southern Connecticut State University in education. Perhaps you know him well. He runs a website called Backyard Road Trips, and he also co-hosts the Backyard Road Trips podcast. He lives in Plymouth with his wife, his 3 sons, his dog, and his cat. So I again want to thank the Corning Foundation and the Friends of Libraries for sponsoring, and all 50 of us who are watching live and the other 100 or so that will watch on demand. Let's give a big virtual round of applause to Zack for joining us here tonight. And Zack, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
All right. Well, thanks, Robert, and the Tewksbury Library for having me back. So I'm thrilled to be here. So fun fact that this book, Distilled in Boston, which I will be sharing information about with you today, was just released on Monday. So this is the official virtual book release of Distilled in Boston. So thanks for joining me for it. So what I'm going to do is tell you a little bit about my what got me to be writing about spirits in the first place and writing this book, Distilled in Boston. So give you a little bit of the background story about that. And then we'll get right into the book itself. So with it, we're going to spend some time talking about the history of spirits in the Boston area and focusing really on the colonial era. And then we're going to go into how to use this book as a guidebook of sorts while you're either visiting a certain region, or to make it a destination in itself if you want to take a distillery tour of certain regions of Boston. So that's what we're going to do. Follow that up by definitely asking any questions, and I'll hope to provide some good answers for you, or any comments that you might have as well. And so what I like to call this book is it's a bit of like going back to school. So how this book is separated. So first of all, you're going to be learning a lot of different subjects as you go through this book. And the first one is history. So you have your history covered with just the history of spirits in the Boston area. You also have your science in this book. So this does go into the science of distilling, certainly in a Reader's Digest type of fashion. I'm not going to be going through every single spirit and how each one differs in distillation, but it is a general speaking how spirits are created. So there's your science component of the book. And there's also a geography/English section. And that's really going to be when each distillery in the Boston area is profiled. It's talked about where it's located and what's the story behind it. And that was really one of the things that I really enjoyed doing, is finding out why the names of these places are such. Sometimes they're obvious just based on their geographic location, and some have quite the story to tell about it. And we'll get into that in a little bit. And finally, there's math. So you're going to learn some math when you're reading this book, because as the cover says, a history and guide with cocktail recipes. Well, yes, you can make many of these cocktails, hopefully using the spirits that are featured in this book, but you can make them on your own. So it actually has a recipe section of it, and quite a healthy recipe section of it. I'm not saying the drinks are healthy. I'm just saying there's quite a few recipes. there for you to follow. So that's basically a little bit in a nutshell what you're going to be seeing with this book. But before we get there, I do want to share with you a little bit about me. So if anyone was here for the Classic Restaurants talk, I believe it was last year, welcome back. So if not, so this is maybe you don't know much about me, and tell you a little bit about it. So welcome to the wonderful world of craft distilleries in the Boston area. So from the North Shore to the South Shore, from the Cape to Nantucket, and of course, Beantown itself, let Distilled in Boston guide you through the region's excellent selection of craft distilleries, each with its own backstory and each with a distinct repertoire of fantastic spirits to sample along the way. Dive into the region's distilling history. Did you know that once upon a time, Boston and the coastal towns to the north of it were a hotbed for rum manufacturing? Before we get too far along in the book, I wanted to share with you my own journey in writing this book. Not because I'm an egoist, but because I come from a much different background than many in this subject. I call my journey From Booze to Booze, or Spirits to Spirits, as my first two books, as you can see there in the picture, were on folklore. So as Robert said, I was an American Studies major at Boston University. And my thesis as a senior, I had an independent study, and it was creating a thesis work about folklore of New England. And that was something that I always had a real passion about. From there, a few years later, I decided to see if I could take that and turn it into a less academic and a more fun collection, which became Connecticut Lore. And with Connecticut Lore, it was, again, the root was that thesis there, which I realized, most of or a lot of the stories here in this thesis are rooted in Connecticut. So Connecticut won. And I am from Connecticut as well. So anyways, so that was where it goes from booze, get it like ghosts, to booze with a Z, or spirits to spirits. You got to love a good pun. So again, going to college in the great city of Boston at BU as an American Studies major. After graduating, I said to myself, I had a truly amazing college experience, but what does one do with an American Studies degree? And although I did go into education as a profession, furthering this was becoming a writer, but coming at whatever I write under two lenses, one through the love of research and learning, and the other through a travel lens. So all the work kind of has this, and I call it, along with my website, Meaningful Travel on the Local Level. So as I said before, the first book was called Connecticut Lore and stemmed from this thesis. Then it was followed by more Connecticut Lore 3 years later. And after crisscrossing the Nutmeg State, it dawned on me that I actually live in Massachusetts. Taking a more historical approach, A History Lover's Guide to the South Shore was released in 2020. And here's a little picture of that one. So funny story and this gets to why I started writing about spirits, the drink spirits in the first place. So funny story that the History Lover's Guide is divided into chapters about each town in the region. It highlights historical places and provides a historical overview of each town. As part of it, I decided to add a restaurant recommendation to each chapter. My editor approached me after I turned in the final manuscript and said that I had to take all of this out. All the restaurants were simply not related to history. So although I was disappointed, I understood the point. But because of my restaurant reviews, as well as others that I'd written about in various publications, I was asked to take on the Classic Restaurants of Boston project, which was released in 2021. This led to Distilled in Boston. The project was already in the works between my editor, Mike Kinsella, and Rhonda Kalman, who is the owner of Boston Harbor Distillery, but an author needed to be found. I thought it could be fascinating, and I agreed to it. So through this title and all of my others, the research, learning, and understanding is such an outstanding element to it. The other, though, is the travel aspect. In 2018, I launched a website and later podcast called Backyard Road Trips, which focuses, as do my books, like this idea of meaningful travel on the local level. Realizing as I have, especially after becoming a father, that local adventures can just be exhilarating as those that are far away. Focusing on museums, nature walks, restaurants, breweries, and family-friendly attractions, the website has grown to also include this podcast hosted by myself and my longtime friend and fellow traveler, Jim Wheeler. So Now on to Distilled in Boston. So in one of the places so each of these distilleries that I focus on in the book are in the Boston area, hence the name. But there are a few peripheral figures or places that I also included. It could be mixologists, such as the cocktail guru who lives in Dartmouth, Mass. It could be someone like Irene Tan. You can see the picture of her with myself in the bottom left of my screen. I'm not sure if it's also here bottom left, who is a whiskey sommelier and who actually lives in Connecticut, but uses a lot of spirits from this region. And another one that I came across and spoke to for this was the Adirondack Barrel Cooperage. And although they're located in upstate New York, speaking to Kelly Blazowski, who runs this cooperage with her husband, Joe. So she also works for the County Tourism Commission. So bringing a tourism element into this book, I found also very important. So the out-of-towner or the local can utilize it as a guidebook to Eastern Massachusetts' growing craft distillery scene. Of course, since the writing of it, one distillery has closed and others have opened in its place, but this title features stalwarts of the industry, including Bully Boy, Boston Harbor Distillery, and Short Path. In the pictures here, you can see, so you have a still there, so a massive still at that, located in Glen Farmer in Franklin, Massachusetts. You have the cover of the book, again, myself and Irene Tan, the barrel being charred at the Adirondack Barrel Cooperage in upstate New York. And finally, the last of the craft. So once it's all distilled, you can make a wonderful cocktail with it, such as the Grand 10 picture there. So we're going to dive into the history a bit. So the history of distilling in Massachusetts, and mostly rooted in the Boston area. So this is not a full history. You can read the whole book for that, but this will give you a snapshot of what it was like and how we got where we are today. So before we dive into the current era, it's important to reflect on the history of distilling in the Boston area. From the colonial era to the present, through much of the latter half of the 20th century, the region was not a hotbed for spirits, but historically, alcohol, namely rum, was an integral part of the economy of the Boston area. Although the current trend of distilleries in the Boston area is relatively new, starting with Nantucket's 888 distillery in 2000, the presence of distilleries and distilled spirits in general has become part of the fabric of the region. Boston and its coastal environs played a major role in the notorious triangular trade, in which the importation and exportation of molasses and rum was supplemented by the slave trade. Many Boston area distilleries manufacture vodka and even whiskey, but historically rum is the liquor most associated with the Bay State. The roots of rum harken back to the 1600s, when it was invented in the West Indies. A few decades later, rum manufactured thrived in Boston, and the city boasted numerous distilleries. Even prior to 1690, rum had become associated with the city. North of Boston, distilleries such as Caldwell's in Newburyport and Lawrence Distilling in Medford were some of the most well-known in the region. Many of the rum distilleries were located on the shore, where the same proprietors were ship owners as well. Most of these industries were important in colonial America. A perfect example of this was the Cabots, who owned their namesake wharf in Beverly and distilled rum on site, eventually selling the distillery and wharf to try their hand successfully in privateering. Today, this legacy lives on in Andrew Cabot's privateer rum in Ipswich. And that's why you can see in the pictures here, you can see a cocktail made with privateer reserve rum, which plays on history here. So Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Puritans, who are often thought of as having an all work, no play mentality. In actuality, alcoholic drink is one vice that the Puritans allowed themselves. Rum played a major role in the American colonies and was known especially in the area north of Boston. It was first made in Barbados in the 1640s. Originally, the spirit went by the name Kill Devil for the burning taste. Another early term was rumbullion, which translates to big quarrel, and thus was shortened to rum. And by 1660, the term rum appeared. Unlike other spirits, which can be made from a variety of ingredients, such as whiskey, which can be made from a variety of grains, rum is based only on sugarcane. Some are made from sugarcane juice and some from molasses, but the original ingredients are still sugarcane. Molasses, made from the sugarcane juice of the West Indies, was imported into the New England colonies. Here it was turned into rum, which was traded to Europe and West Africa. In West Africa, an unfortunate return was enslaved persons shipped to the West Indies, supplementing the triangular trade. In the mid-18th century, 25 rum distilleries dotted the landscape in such towns as Watertown, Haverhill, and Charlestown. And by 1783, there were 60 rum distilleries in Massachusetts alone. More proof that rum was king was in the fact that in 1791, more than 7 million gallons of molasses were imported into the state of Massachusetts alone. During the colonial era in New England, there were some 159 distilleries, with rum being the primary product. Rum was used as a celebratory drink for such events as commemorating a new construction and social gatherings. An example of the trade in action would be a ship leaving Boston, loaded with barrels of rum. Of course, the crew would imbibe along the route. On reaching Africa, the remaining rum was traded. The ship was then filled with Africans and gold. The ship then traveled to the islands of the West Indies, where the enslaved persons were unloaded to work at the sugarcane plantations. Sent from the West Indies to Boston would be copious hogsheads of molasses. A hogshead is a unit of measure, a cask with about twice the volume as a regular-sized barrel. In Boston, the molasses was used to make rum. Even in the late 19th century, when rum manufacture was on the decline, New England was still the place for rum, accounting for 7 of the 8 rum distilleries nationwide. And Massachusetts was still the focal point, with 6 of the 7 located in the Bay State. So although distilleries operated at a steady pace throughout the colonial period, the first stills were not commercial enterprises. These were placed in homes, with the drink used as medicine and as an offering to thirsty guests. Rum was even served at the inauguration of George Washington. In the towns north of Boston, rum distilling was a popular enterprise. Just north of Boston, the city of Medford was synonymous with its rums, and others such as Newburyport, Salem, and Beverly. Rum lost its footing in New England for multiple reasons. One, which is association with slavery. The concept of slavery was terrible to devout Christians in New England. There was also the excise tax placed on the importation of molasses. To combat this, Congress incentivized using products grown in America instead of importing them from foreign lands. The era of rum as king would end by the early years of the 1800s for 3 primary reasons. The first was the Embargo Act of 1807, which outlawed the importation of cheap British molasses. Second, the legal importation of enslaved persons ceased a year later as the frontier expanded and Americans pushed west. Finally, ingredients needed for whiskey making were found readily and cheaply. Thus, whiskey overthrew rum as America's favorite spirit. But not only did New England's seaside location benefit the distilleries with exportation during the years of the triangular trade, but 2 centuries later, the ocean also became a source of illegal libation importation. The term rum runner is used as a name for different New England establishments, including a rum runner boat in Newport, Rhode Island, and the now defunct Rum Runners, a bar on Cape Cod. Rum running was popularized as a byproduct of the legalization of alcohol during Prohibition. The term comes from a supply of contraband rum or other liquor such as champagne, gin, or even poor quality whiskey, also known as rot gut whiskey, which was stored on such aquatic vessels as schooners or steamboats, anchored in international waters in an area known as Rum Row. Rum Row was situated outside the nation's boundary between Cape Ann and Cape Cod. These ships carried the liquid gold from such faraway lands as Nova Scotia and even England. They would dock offshore under the black of night. Smaller boats would meet them for their share of the illegal substances. Another way the ocean-faring New Englanders could subvert the Prohibition decree was through lobstermen, who would fill their traps with bottles. Although New England's distillery heyday was during the 1700s, the spirit of the region has always been strong, even as far as rum running during the time of Prohibition. With an emphasis on craft, a batch of distilleries today call the Boston area home and specialize in making excellent small batch spirits. So let's begin the tour. And here with the pictures, we have one, the older cartoon is from Deacon Giles Distillery, and I'll wait to tell you a little bit about that during our tour of that distillery. And also you can see Liberty Tree Rum, another historical association. And then of course we have the spirits aging in barrels there at Chattermark in Charlestown. So the spirit of craftsmanship is really something that stands out in the spirit making process, really from grain to glass. So not only are these distilleries handcrafting spirits of all kind, and many that are barrel aging them, which means they're not ready for consumption for a long period of time, but also the folks at these distilleries are having a hand in designing them themselves. Also behind the scenes operations such as bottling by hand, putting stickers on the label, and of course, crafting these delicious cocktails. So if you see the top picture there, so of the man that's putting labels on the rum, that's Andrew McCabe from Astraluna Brands. Astraluna Brands consists of Cape Cod and Islands Distillers and Liberty Tree, as well as a different series of canned cocktails. And not only is he owner and head distiller, you can find him bottling his own product and putting labels on his own product. So these people in these distilleries really are learning every aspect of it. So stories from Chattermark, which is a newer distillery under the Tobin Bridge in Charlestown, they told me how they had to refurbish the whole entire space basically by hand. So it's incredible what these folks are actually doing in their craftsmanship. And I can hardly make myself a Kraft macaroni and cheese, but that's another story altogether. So we're going to let Distilled in Boston be your guidebook. So the greater Boston area is broken up into manageable chunks for your distillery tour. Head up north for Deacon Giles and Privateer. Go west for Neshoba Valley, south for Dirty Water, Glen Farmer, and Working Man. Combine this with an already planned vacation stop. As stop by 888 when you're in Nantucket. The Cape not only has South Hollow Spirits, which is easy to spend a day at along with its Truro vineyard, but also has the tasting room of Cape and the Island Distillers, which is part of the Astraluna Brands. In Boston, Bully Boy, Grand 10, Boston Harbor Distillery, Chattermark, and Short Path are either within the city's confines or just outside it. These distilleries can be visited for a destination in their own right or as an aside to an area. And make sure to check out each description to see which the distillery offers the public. Some, such as Bully Boy or Glen Farmer, are full service with a bar or even food in some cases. Others, like Privateer, are open for special events or curbside bottle pickup. And here you can see the South Boston Pride here of Grand 10 and the front of the Boston Harbor Distillery, which is went through many different unique places, including building Mayan sweepers, and the latest incarnation was as actually an ice cream manufacturer and storage before it became a distillery. So stories from the stills. So some interesting facts of these distilleries in this region. So one of my favorites, my favorite story of all of them has to be, as you can see the devilish picture there, and you saw another picture in an earlier slide talking about history. And this is the story of the Deacon Giles Distillery in Salem. So actually not too far away from where you're located, still north of Boston. So I want to tell you a little bit about that one and then go into some of the names and interesting facts of many of the other ones that are located in the region. So clearly, alcohol was ingrained in the colonial and post-Revolutionary War society of Massachusetts. In the early to mid-19th century, reform movements swept the young nation, calling for progressive ideals such as an end to slavery and the advocacy of women's rights. Alcoholism reached its high point in early 1800s America. In response was a temperance movement to combat liquor, considered by the movement to be a societal destroyer. Religious zealot and teetotaler, Reverend George Barrel Cheever, kind of ironic, the middle name is Barrel, right? Subscribed to the school of thought that alcohol was the devil's medicine and a corrupter of man. Cheever of Salem wrote a short story detailing the ills of the distillery. The Dream, or the True History of Deacon Giles Distillery. At the time, Salem had 4 distilleries. Cheever wrote his story as an expose of the detriment that alcohol production causes a community. In the story, the distillers are depicted as pure evil by their own merit. Cheever likens the family-owned distillery to the fiery pits of hell, where not only does the distillery create illicit liquids, but also distills on the Sabbath. As the story progresses, a group of efficient, unpaid workers come in at night to help at the distillery, Giles locks them inside. Unbeknownst to Deacon Giles, the workers were actually demons, and you can see by the picture there, secretly inscribe on the barrels sayings such as a potion from the lake of fire and brimstone, in insanity and murder. When the hogshead barrels of alcohol are brought to the taverns, customers frightened by the ghastly sayings bring the barrels back to the distillery. With so much unsold product, Giles' business was eventually ruined. Culling from history, so the current Deacon Giles Distillery in Salem is named after Cheever's story, which is pretty cool. In that picture there, as you can see, there is a light fixture on it. That's actually on the walls of their distillery. So it's so cool how they took this historical relic of a tale from Salem, historic Salem in the 1800s, and then named their own distillery from it, and all of their products and their marketing is really based on this kind of this kind of vibe. And of course, you're in Salem itself, which has a bit of its own story to tell. So the distillery story was first published in 1835, and Cheever wrote a companion piece called Deacon Jones Brewery with the same message, with demons brewing this time instead of distilling. So in rebuttal, John Stone, who was a Salem distiller and also a deacon, took Cheever to court over this glaring likeness to himself, as the details about Giles and Stone bore an uncanny resemblance to each other. Cheever was put in jail for only a couple days afterwards and then wrote the brewery story. So a few more names I want to talk about. So one that I mentioned was Short Path. Short Path is located in Everett. And the name Short Path, so which is neat, they distill all kinds of different spirits, from your more traditional, such as rum and vodka, gin, whiskey, but they also do triple sec and Amaro and all these different ones. And their name Short Path, is talking about the shortest path from the ingredients that they have to the distillery itself. And if you look on their labels, each of their different spirits has a different bird on it representing the spirit itself in like a pencil and ink drawing, so which is pretty neat looking. They use all local products from New England. I believe the furthest is like New York State or something. So it's very, very close by for their products, taking the shortest path. Another one, Dirty Water Distillery in Plymouth. So you'd think that, oh, Dirty Water might be in reference to the Boston area, of course, the song Dirty Water. So you've got that. But you also, for them, the irony is the original location of the Dirty Water Distillery was outside the town brook where the Pilgrims, which was the reason the Pilgrims stayed in Plymouth, due to the cleanliness of the water. Kind of ironic. But the name Dirty Water is a code for when they started distilling at that time illegally. They were distilling water, they said. So a batch of dirty water was ready. So that was their code. Also Bully Boy, so one of the more popular distilleries in this region. So the owner's grandfather was actually friends with Teddy Roosevelt, and he popularized the phrase bully, which is the bully pulpit and bully for you. It was also the name of a family draft horse, which is depicted on their label. Another, Glen Farmer, you can see that in the bottom right. It's really an idyllic location. This is in Franklin, Massachusetts. It's an old mill. Really surprised me at that one. Since I was there, it's actually won a bunch of accolades, been featured in Yankee Magazine and such places like that. You would never know on the main street. It sits across from a 99 and like next to a gas station. You totally could not tell. But the name Glen Farmer is there for many reasons. One of it is it's located in a glen, hence the name Glen, and Farmer, because they're the husband and wife team that owns it are pharmacists by trade. So the PH in Farmer, and also Farmer, these distilleries get something called a farmer's distillery license. And that's how for the state they're located. So you have they're classified as. So you have that name Farmer in there. And a fun fact, originally their logo had the R with a little X. It's kind of like a prescription, as furthering this pharmacy aspect of their name. But yeah, that really wasn't approved too much by the government. Didn't like that, since that could be construed as it would be medicinal. Hey, what, alcohol is not medicinal? But, so Liberty Tree, another one, evokes Boston's roots. And you have some of the regionality, Cape and the Islands, Boston Harbor Distillery, Neshoba Valley, talk about the region where they're located. Chattermark has a relation to owner John, who is a veteran, his time in the service. And why there's a picture of the Tobin Bridge is because that distillery is literally located right underneath the Tobin Bridge. If you're going north on Route 1 there on the Tobin, and you look down and you see a bunch of new cars just on, looks like, kind of an area that should be written about in a Dennis Lehane novel. This is actually the furthest point in Charlestown, and it's not where the cars are, but it's close to there. It's where Chattermark is located, directly underneath the Tobin Bridge. The first time I went there, I have my GPS in, and I'm like, am I going to the right place? This is a little bit, a little strange, but what a cool spot it is too. And then going into privateer. So privateer plays on the profession of owner Andrew Cabot's ancestors, who owned a distillery and then switched to privateering during the time of the Revolution. So you can see many of these names have something that has a really cool backstory to it. So, and that was, as the writer of this, it was just fascinating for me to dive in and just to understand where all this comes together. And in the historian in me really, really enjoyed that part of it so much. And from that, we're on the distillery trail. And as I'm saying, one of the most rewarding aspects of writing is learning about the topic I'm investigating. So taking a subject, whether it be booze or booze, right, going back to that reference to folklore, it's digging into the research that really brings me joy. The title was by far one of, if not the most fun I've had in writing a book. First of all, my prior expertise in this area was more about enjoying a tasty cocktail rather than understanding the science behind distilling. Not only did I walk away having learned much more about how to make alcohol than I ever guessed I would, but I was able to meet some truly fantastic people along the way and got to tell their stories and the stories of their businesses. There was not one distillery that I visited that did not welcome me with open arms. When drinking spirits from the Boston area, know that these libations are crafted with love and care by truly excellent individuals. So I hope reading this, you'll enjoy a trip through the distilleries of Boston. You'll be able to take in a little history and science along the way and learn how to make a damn good cocktail using local spirits. Again, what I call this book is like a trip back to school. So you have your history, you have your science with learning how to distill and talking about that. And then you've got your geography in English with the locations and then the stories behind them. And finally, you've got your math. And this takes the math part of things. So here's a couple of the cocktails that are featured in this book. So the first one is by Chattermark, and it is a wonderful, so it's quite a wonderful drink there they call the Charlestown Buck, made with their bourbon. Fun fact that Chattermark believes it's the first grain to glass bourbon or bourbon that is distilled within the city limits of Boston. So fun fact about that one. So then you have the Raising Arizona. This is by Deacon Giles. And this one is using their vodka, but mixing it with green tea and some honey. It's quite an elaborate cocktail. And the last one is Glen Farmer, and that's it's called the Bog, and using their Bog, which is a cranberry vodka. And let me tell you, some of these, like taking that cranberry vodka just even by itself is quite tasty. So if you are interested in this book, so again, what it looks like right here, what it looks like on the screen. So you can find this book at your local, hopefully your local bookstores and libraries, but you can also find it places such as your bigger ones, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc., as well as the History Press, which is my publisher, so Arcadia History Press. And going back again, if you would like to hear more, so me going on about different things, make sure you take a look at backyardroadtrips.com and take a listen to the Backyard Road Trips podcast, where Jim and I talk about everything from travel to sampling a couple of libations ourselves, and even fun stories about being a parent. At this time, first of all, I want to again thank you all for joining me here on this maiden voyage of Distilled in Boston. Really appreciate you tuning in today. I do see, I think there are some questions here, so we can switch over to those. I'll leave up some information in case you're interested in that as well.
So let's give Zach a big virtual round of applause for a wonderful presentation. And let's take 10 to 15 minutes of audience questions if you have them. So circling back to the beginning, some other favorite cocktails that folks had: Dirty Martini, Manhattan, the Moscow Mule, Ghost Pepper Paloma, Cape Cod vodka and cranberry juice with a twist of lime. So I hope you all are enjoying drinks while Zachary spoke, okay?
I have a water, ironically.
Oh, there you go. Patricia says that she's already pre-ordered your book. She hopes to have it by tomorrow, and she's planning to share it with her family and friends in Arizona.
Great.
Great. And Patricia, by the way, a former Tewksbury resident. Let's see. Bob says, what is the difference between rum and reserved rum?
So my guess would be if the term reserve typically means a rare, it could be barrel aged is kind of what I'm getting off of that. So a lot of rum, so the rum that we think about that if you're having Bacardi or you're having something from the Caribbean kind of mass marketed, you think of this like cloyingly sweet spirit, which like even the thought of like, I'm thinking if I'm taking a sip right now, kind of my mouth like, oh, like I'm drinking like a grown-up version of a pixie stick without the sourness to it, just like so sugary. The rum, the New England rum and Boston rum in general is very different, and it has more of a whiskey quality to it. And it's often because much of the rum is barrel aged, and actually the rum color is from the barrels themselves. So if you have a white rum, that's not barrel aged. So clear liquors like your gins, your vodkas, and your white rums are not going to be barrel aged, but both whiskey and rum that's been barrel aged take on that quality of the barrel, giving it that hue. So the reserve would probably just be in reference to the barrel age, maybe small batch, maybe how long it's been aged would be my guess in that kind of regard.
Eva Jane says that she's heading out to her nearest bar to get a cocktail after this Zoom. Angelina says it was an awesome presentation, and she gives you a round of applause. She's enjoying herbal tea while overlooking the water. Darlene says she arrived late to the party, but Darlene, I'm going to send you the recording on Friday morning, so keep an eye out for that, as well as a feedback survey. An anonymous attendee asks, did the distilling process benefit from the influx of Boston, Cambridge area college students and academics?
So, I mean, I'm sure with any of the craft movement, whether it's food, whether it's spirits or alcohol, or even the idea of clothing or any kind of products that are just not mass marketed. I think that, with Boston's population, I'm sure that there is something that goes in hand with first an age group that, well, with college age, maybe it would be like a little bit older than college age might be, because I feel like college age, they'd probably be still into the Bacardi. But Boston as a place with a little bit more sophisticated taste, I do think kind of lends itself to the advent of craft distilleries. And again, the idea of craft and artisanal in general, with just the population that just wants more than Wonder Bread and Bacardi rum.
Sure. Judy says that this was a great presentation and she thanks you. Christine asks, do these distilleries in Massachusetts that you've highlighted break even, or do they actually make a decent profit each year? Do you know the finances behind some of these distilleries?
I don't know the finances exactly, but I mean, I would say they're all dependent on many different things. So each distillery has its own approach, and that's what's kind of highlighted in the book too, where you have some, like if you see the name Bully Boy, they've been around for, it's about, I want to say it's like 12, 14 years, something like that. But in these circles, that's a long time. And they really had to pound the pavement to get where they are. But they're doing, overall doing well. You can find them in many, many states. You have others that are newer. So you have, whether it's Chattermark, whether it's there's even some that have opened up since then. There's Distillery, I believe it's Distillery 43 out in Middleborough area. So Bridgewater, Middleborough. So I'm sure, like any business, these are starting out. There's going to be these hiccups where others that are very well established. I mean, the Boston Harbor Distillery is owned. So who I worked hand in hand with Rhonda Kallman, she began Samuel Adams with Jim Cook. So she's been in the game a long, long time. So with her, she's an established commodity, but she's also, which was very interesting, talking with her, and if you do read the book, there's a bit of this information, what it's like to be a woman in a real male-dominated field, and especially when you're dealing with whiskey, is what they specialize in, and especially because a lot of the whiskey entrepreneurs, the big ones, are located in the South, and kind of her, even though, again, there's no one in this region more established than she is in the alcohol industry, and that she still had to face definite adversity when it came to the whiskey industry and working in it. So it's, but again, there's different levels. And again, some of these, if you look at Glen Farmer, they host weddings there. That's the one with the factory. They went all in. They went in. There's a restaurant. So it's a big deal there. And they're new, but they definitely went for a certain approach. You might have another one like Working Man, which is in Attleboro, or maybe North Attleboro, one of the two. And that's a smaller operation. They have a bar and they distill in the back, but it's much smaller than, down the road at Glen Farmer. So they all, again, serve their own different need and niche. Then you have Privateer, which is very, very well established, especially through rum clubs that got very popular during COVID. And their rum, they basically primarily distill rum. They do a gin too, but they really focus on rum, which is a harder harder spirit, because rum is, is not having a moment like whiskey is, or is not, as versatile in a lot of ways to most people as vodka or something. So rum is kind of a unique spirit in that kind of way. And I think there's so much kind of maybe animosity towards rum due to those, like, rum and cokes or whatever, with the super cloyingly sweet Caribbean rum. But anyway, so Privateer has done it where they are no longer open to the public, and you can pick up, or there's events there, but they also are in stores very, very frequently. And they have some very exquisite rums that are, very aged for years and years. And again, have like I would say more of a whiskey characteristics to it while you're drinking it than a traditional, what you might think of as a rum.
Paul says, I recall Old Mr. Boston from my youth.
Mm-hmm.
They had a recipe book plus other libations. Whatever happened to them? So do you know anything about Old Mr. Boston? Absolutely.
So the cool thing is, one of the people I was talking about, the peripheral people that I tried to include in this book, and one, so is Jonathan Pogash, who is the cocktail guru who wrote the latest edition of the Old Mr. Boston Guide. And he is, again, he lives in the South Coast area, but originally from the New York, New Jersey area. And his father was in the industry, and he took on this Mr. Boston project. So Mr. Boston Guide was going back to, earlier in the 20th century. And it was a bartender's handy guide. It was like a little pocket-sized guide that bartenders had in their back pocket. And it was kind of a Bible of sorts of cocktails. The Mr. Boston, which became just then Boston Distillery, was in Roxbury, I believe, and eventually closed. It was bought by Sazerac. So Sazerac is has the huge company that owns like whatever it is, 10 Bananas, or among other ones that they own there of things you can find easily in your store. It might be like McGillicuddy's and stuff like that. And they still operate the Mr. Boston brand, but I believe the closest distillery that they have is in Maine. They have distilleries all around the country, but I believe it's Maine is the closest. But nothing. They still have the Boston brand. The Mr. Boston Guide, the latest edition was made in 2012, but since Sazerac took it on, it's now you can get it as an app, and you can also go on to Mr. Boston Drinks, I think is the website, and it's super handy where it has literally like, you type in anything. And what's really cool about it is you can actually there's an option that you can do a drop down. You want to see Mr. Boston Guide from 1930. It will literally be the guide from 1930. You can call up 1988. I'm just making these dates up, but it's as far back as around then, all the way up to the 2012 version or whatnot. So you can see how these kind of cocktails have progressed over the years. So it's around in some capacity, but certainly not what it once was. But it was cool interviewing Jonathan about this and his take on that.
Zachary, I don't know if this is a fair question. This is like asking you which of your 3 children is your favorite. But,
Charlie,
do you have a favorite distillery?
I mean, it's so to be honest with you, what I liked about this project, I kept on talking about how much I learned. My knowledge of distilling was zero. So I was completely a novice in this. And that's why I liked writing about it. And I liked learning about it, because my idea is to convey the processes that are happening into a way that the regular person can understand. So if I, like, again, as I said earlier, well, a barrel-aged rum might drink more like a whiskey than a rum that we're used to. An actual rum, like, hardcore rum distiller would probably hate that comment, because there's no way that this would be the same as, but to, I think, a layman or a layperson, it would be, I find the qualities kind of more similar. That being said, about my favorite distilleries themselves, I mean, Boston Harbor is where I started this whole journey with, and they've been awesome. Rhonda's been great. So John Stark was the head distiller there, has been amazing. So that's definitely a place to check out. So Short Path, as I mentioned, they have such a variety of different spirits. So those were 2 of my my favorites, as in really for different reasons. But they've all, I mean, this is going to be pretty, a political way to say it, but politically correct way to say it. They're all, have real aspects of them that stand out, which is, again, and they're all doing something different. There's no carbon copies of one another. And what one person likes, another person might not, and vice versa. But as far as product and overall maybe breadth of their what they have, definitely check out Short Path. And for a really like cool experience, I'd go take one of the whiskey tours of Boston Harbor Distillery.
All right. So Zachary, let's give Zachary a big virtual round of applause once more. Great job with the Q&A. I think we've exhausted all questions and comments. If I missed anyone, I apologize. I think we got them all. Zachary's contact information can be found on his website. His website address is right there. Buy his book, check out his podcast, visit his website. He's got a lot of good stuff and good projects going on. The book was literally released either yesterday or Monday. It's literally Monday, off the press. Yeah, yeah. So definitely check that out. So Zachary, any last words before we wrap it up?
Right. Again, I want to thank all of you for coming out, and Robert, thank you and the Tewksbury Library for having me. So it's really a pleasure doing this, and again, it's been a fun maiden voyage here, Distilled in Boston, which I hope we'll be talking about for the next while around the area. If you see me at a live event, come and make sure to say hi.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Zachary. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Everyone get a drink, okay? Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.